Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thanks for joining us. We are just a few hours from hearing the president laying out his plan to combat ISIS militants in both Iraq and Syria. This, as France's foreign minister says, his country ready to launch airstrikes against the extremists. Let's go live now to ABC's Karen Travers for the latest from D.C.
Good evening. 91% of Americans say they believe ISIS is a threat to the United States, and a large majority say they want to see President Obama get more aggressive. Well, tonight the president is expected to announce new steps in his game plan to defeat ISIS, but administration officials are cautioning this is not a problem that will be solved overnight. The American people want action, and tonight President Obama will lay out the next stages in the U.S. campaign against ISIS. But will it be enough to convince a skeptical public that doesn't think he's being aggressive enough?
Americans don't want a lecture, they want a plan.
The plan the president will detail tonight includes expanding U.S. airstrikes in Iraq and supporting the Iraqis as they take the fight to ISIS there. Today, Secretary of State John Kerry was in Baghdad to meet with leaders of the new Iraqi government. He said the Iraqis can't rely on the U.S. military to beat ISIS.
It will not just be reserved to bombs. It will be comprehensive with Iraqi forces on the ground in Iraq.
The president will also say the U.S. is ramping up its support for the moderate Syrian rebels, including more training by U.S. Special Forces, something the CIA has already been doing covertly. President Obama has told congressional leaders he needs Congress to vote quickly to give him the authority to do that, and he'll also need funding down the road. But Congress is divided on whether to vote for any further military action, with the midterm elections looming in November.
It's critical we support our commander-in-chief as he takes this decisive action. Let's be cautious, let's be deliberate.
A large majority of Americans support U.S. airstrikes against ISIS in Syria. The president's not expected to announce any decision on taking out targets there. But the president is expected to emphasize, as he's been doing for the past several days, that the United States is ready to strike wherever necessary to defeat ISIS. Reporting live from the White House, Karen Travers, ABC News. Back to you.
Karen, thank you very much. And as we said, we will be going and hearing from the president live at 9 p.m. Now, the president's address, which, by the way, if you haven't put the context together, it comes on the eve of the 13th anniversary of the 9/11 terror attacks. And if you want to know where the public pulse is on this, there's a new poll out from NBC and the Wall Street Journal that shows just how the American public feels. And in fact, they feel more unsafe than they have at any time since the terror attacks of September 11th. And the president's handling of international affairs is also receiving low marks from the public. Poll showing that only 38% approve of the job the president is doing when it comes to foreign affairs, while 56% disapprove. And 61% believe that the U.S. taking military action against ISIS is in the U.S.'s interest. 13% saying it's not, and 24% saying they don't have enough information on this. And this number, interesting as well. When it comes to U.S. military action against ISIS, 2 in 5 Americans said the U.S. should only carry out airstrikes. More than a third saying there should be airstrikes and combat troops, while 15% say the military shouldn't get involved at all. And finally, 71% support airstrikes against the insurgents in Iraq, and less than a quarter are opposed to it. And when it comes to strikes against insurgents in Syria, and this a major change from where the public felt not long ago, nearly 2 out of every 3 Americans support attacks in Syria, airstrikes. Now, let's bring in our first guest, Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut. He joins us live from our nation's capital tonight. Congressman, thank you very much for a few minutes. I appreciate it.
Good to be back, Richard.
You know, it's clear that the president is going to be addressing not so much a conflicted public, but a public that really, based off the beheadings, has done a 180 in a lot of the polls that we've seen. And more than that, they want action, but it isn't exactly clear what that action should resemble. Will there be a global coalition? And will the Congress that you serve in go along with the president, let alone be asked to? As we come to you this hour, what is the expectation that the president will ask of Congress? And what's your feeling how much power the Congress is willing to give this president if they are asked?
Well, yeah, that's kind of the $64,000 question, Richard. You know, is he going to come to the Congress to ask, first of all, for an authorization for the use of military force? There's a substantial number of people around here who think that the authorization that he currently has, the two of them, one pertains to al-Qaeda. ISIS, of course, is not al-Qaeda. And the other one pertains to Saddam Hussein in Iraq, that is insufficient. This is at heart a constitutional argument. How much need he consult? You know, to date, we have not been asked to vote on anything, but that's a very interesting question. Once you get past that question, and by the way, I should say that I'm in the camp of saying that the president should allow Congress to debate and ultimately give him authorization, then you get to questions where I think there's a little bit more alignment. For example, I would tell you that around here the feeling is that, and this is across party lines, that the president should have the authority to do what he's been doing for the last couple of weeks, which are some fairly effective airstrikes in Iraq against ISIS targets, working, of course, with the boots on the ground being not American, but Peshmerga and Iraqi. Then you get into sort of more complicated questions around, well, what about Syria? Syria makes this whole thing very, very complicated. Do we do airstrikes in Syria? And even more controversially, should we be more aggressively supporting those quote-unquote moderate rebels that, of course, are there to try to bring down Assad in Syria, but are spending, in fact, most of their time in fights with ISIS?
You know, the president has made it clear, as you know very well, Congressman, that he was elected in large part to get us out of Iraq and Afghanistan, and the idea of putting American boots on the ground was a non-starter with him. But apparently, behind the scenes, a lot of his commanders, and even publicly, some of the retired ones like General Zinni say, airstrikes alone won't cut it. You need a couple of American brigades there if this thing's going to work here. You can't just surgically take them out from the sky. Do you think the president tonight will again double down saying this is going to be from above, this will not be with American blood, you know, on the ground here potentially? Where does he go there? Can he make that promise anymore?
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't think there's much, there may be some, but I don't think there's much support for the idea of putting American ground troops in any meaningful number in Iraq, or certainly not in Syria. Now, you know, do you need a couple special operations guys there doing lasing of targets? Do you want some trainers there training the Peshmerga, working with the Peshmerga? Maybe. But the idea of brigades on the ground in Iraq, I think, is a non-starter. But by the way, it need not be U.S. boots on the ground. There is a Peshmerga, the Kurds. There is an Iraqi military, which, while they did not distinguish themselves in the last couple of months, you know, with training, with backing, and this is critical, with an Iraqi government that actually resonates with the Iraqi people, they may get right back in the game. And of course, the other piece of this is to us not doing it all. Look, I think this is a non-starter if this is not a broad global coalition, including people like the Russians, and dare I say it, including in some way, shape, or form the Iranians, who of course are like them or not, and most of us are profoundly suspicious of the Iranians. They are a key player in the region, and of course other Muslim nations. I think if that coalition is not there, one, the support is not there, and number two, it would be a mistake. If ISIS can frame this coming battle as ISIS against the United States, that is a very, very bad way to start this process of trying to try to make them go away.
Should tonight just be about dealing with ISIS, or should tonight also be more broadly about the region here? Because, yes, obviously, as we've articulated, there's a real threat here. But what happens to Syria? And moreover, even if we don't know what we're going to do as it relates to the Ukraine, there are competing asks in front of your electoral body as to whether or not funding should be allotted for it. Should the president focus on one thing and speak toughly to that point, or should you talk about the broader issues that are all happening concurrently around the globe that have U.S. interests at stake?
Well, you know, it depends on what you mean by all the interests. I mean, no. Should he be talking about Ukraine here? I suspect not. But there are some fundamental questions that Americans need to think about. You know, it is the policy of the U.S. government right now that President Assad of Syria go away. Now think about that. Let's imagine that we had wild success and tomorrow morning President Assad of Syria is gone. Guess who now owns Damascus? The answer, of course, is probably ISIS or maybe some combination of Hezbollah and other Iranian-backed militias. Do we want that? I don't think so. So we've got, I think, consider what exactly our objectives are in Syria in particular. You know, the other thing that should come up, two other things. One is, you know, we could continue to struggle against obscene groups like ISIS for a very long time if we don't have more of a conversation about the conditions that give rise to these groups. This is not a group that is naturally attractive to the average rational human being, right? I mean, their ideology is out of the 7th century. They are, you know, bloody almost to the point of being diabolical. So how do they thrive, and how can we end those conditions, those underlying conditions which give rise to these kinds of groups? If we don't address that, 15 years from now, we'll be having exactly this conversation about, you know, should it be airplanes or boots on the ground or what have you.
Congressman, it will be very interesting to hear in less than 3 hours from the president, but I certainly appreciate your time, and the president will be making his pitch as well beyond the American public to leaders of Congress as early as tomorrow. Congressman Jim Hines, thank you so much.
Thanks, Richard.
All right, let's bring it to panel right now. We got Dominic Carter and Andrew Whitman, as always. Andrew, talk about the stakes here for the president tonight. This isn't about elections, but it is about elections, and Democrats are very nervous that if he doesn't come out declaratively and strong, and we've seen the poll numbers already a tenuous Democratic candidate out there is going to be hurt even more in a month and a half.
Well, it's a double-edged sword for the president. I mean, first he's got to establish what he wants to do, and of course the most difficult thing in politics or in governance is to actually state, I want to do A, B, C, and D, because then you set up a criteria to be determined so that people can grade you as to whether you've accomplished A, B, C, and D. So I think he has to be very clear about what he wants to do with American military force.
Does he ask Congress for their permission?
I don't think he does. We already heard from the White House that they think that he's got the right to do it without their say-so. Congress, and especially congressional Republicans, are going to argue the opposite and are going to demand that he come to them in the first place.
So he doesn't hold it over
and then,
for
of
the
course,
next 2 months.
he's got to live up to and be graded on whether what he's done is successful or not. And by the way, Republicans in Congress are going to criticize him no matter what he does. So.
Well, then it comes down to tone, Dominic. And while it shouldn't be the show, it should be the substance, it is going to matter about the tone. People don't want to be lectured tonight. They want to understand what's at stake, why it's in our interest, especially from a guy who argued that he was elected here to get us out of 2 wars. How does he have to come across the American public tonight?
Well, remember, Richard, this is the same president that on Meet the Press on Sunday admitted that while he understands he doesn't always get it, the theater part of being the president of the United States. The backdrop he has to come across is very serious, and this president, who's always deliberate, has to make a strong case to the body in front of him, but also to the American people. He's well aware, those poll numbers that you just showed, and so things have dramatically changed within a matter of a year. And Americans, there's no other way around this. We know it's very complicated in that region of the world, but Americans want something done about ISIS.
And I think they want to hear strategy, not some amorphous thing, something specific. What's our goal? What are we trying to do? How are we going to try and do this here? And that has hurt the president, I think, in no small part, the fact that he said they're still figuring out what their strategy was just a couple weeks ago. And obviously, we'll be tuning in at 9 o'clock here. We'll bring you the address of the president, and then we'll talk immediately after as to what we heard. Now, head over to Facebook and Twitter and sound off on a question tonight. What do you want to hear from the president in his outlining of a plan to combat ISIS? All right, when we come back, after a rocky primary election win, the governor of New York, he's now pushing on setting his eyes on his next opponent, Republican Rob Astorino, who says Governor Cuomo lost and won on the same night. We'll have a look at what went down last night and what we can take away from it.